to the Me, Myself, and Hopefully You podcast. My name is Tarek, a university student who has no clue as to what he wants to do with his life. So rather than get a job, I decided to do what every man who has nothing to do with his life is starting to do, and that is start a podcast where hopefully I can get some inspiration or some life advice, and if all else fails, just have an interesting conversation. So if you want to join me in having no clue as to what you want to do with your life, then make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss new podcast episodes out every single week. Ladies and gentlemen, this week I sit with an attorney and expert on the criminal mind. We discuss an array of topics such as the moral and ethical complications of being a lawyer, what it's like to defend a man nicknamed the Block Monster who had murdered a mother in the same room as her children, standing in front of the Supreme Court, the Colorado Movie Theatre killings, and so much more. Before we get into it, please do consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss a new episodes and to put a smile on this beautiful face. And yeah, without further ado, my guest at this time, it's the incredible Kerrie Droban.
I just want to start off with some quick fire questions just to get to know you a bit more. The first question is, who would you consider as your role model or your inspiration?
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, probably, Anne Rule would be an obvious one, just because I think she's the goddess of true crime. And I really loved the way that she was sort of a pioneer and how she changed the way true crime is presented. I mean, she was not journalistic. She was very sort of narrative nonfiction, which I love because it blends fiction and truth together. It makes it read like a story, which I loved about her. And then probably on another front, Glennon Melton Doyle, who is totally different genre of writing, but I really admire her and I admire her story and her, I've heard her speak a million times. And I just think she's very courageous and sort of pioneers women to be better and empowered. So I appreciate those two women as role models.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, that first one was really quite interesting because I've always, I love like history or just anything that's like a documentary essentially. But I always find that the best documentaries are usually the ones that use fiction and use sort of dramatization to just make it a bit more entertaining. So like a TV series almost, so where it's like 4 or 5 episodes for a particular period of time focusing on something. And I just find it way more interesting. Or, I mean, obviously, in linking it back to you, when it's true crime, when it's more dramatized rather than, oh, this is what happened, then this, then this, then this. It's just, it flows better. It's a story, and you're more entertained as well. So it's like, it's partially fake, but it's also very much real. Like the core of it is real. And I always think that just keeps you more engaged. And I think there's an increase in popularity when it comes to that sort of genre of things. My second quickfire question to you is, if there was a house fire and everyone was saved, any animals, any animals were saved as well, but you could only keep one thing, what would that one thing be? Bearing in mind your phone and your laptop are safe because everyone keeps their phone and their laptop on them. So I'm not gonna let you pick one of those.
Oh shoot! I was gonna say I would grab my my laptop.
Everyone says yeah. So initially, I didn't let people pick their phone, and then I stopped letting people pick their laptop because they kept on saying either phone or laptop. So now I say no, not phone or laptop. It has to be something else.
Wow. That's an interesting question. I probably would pick another form of writing, which would be diaries or journals, because to me that's information and it's historical data and it cannot be replaced. So it's, I think if that burned, I wouldn't have a resource to go back to. So, I have a ton of them over time. And it's just notes about, future books that I want to write or ideas. It's kind of like an idea journal. And so if I lost that, I think I would be in trouble. It would be like, I wouldn't be able to recreate it. So I've actually thought about that a lot, especially in this last year. Like, what would I grab if I had grabbed that? And that would be that would be what I would grab.
That would be the thing. How many would you say that you have?
I probably have over 20. So they're
Wow.
just, yeah, they're color coded. They're filled with ideas because I get ideas all the time. And a lot of times I don't have an opportunity to actually work on the piece or write it down. Sometimes it's just a phrase. Sometimes it's a character arc. Different things that just come to me, and I'm very old fashioned that way. So I have to physically write the thing instead of dictating it or keeping it on a computer or something. So it's, yeah, so there's a little insider
Yeah, no,
thing about me.
I can definitely relate to that because I mean, I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, I have my notes for the podcast on a notebook as well. I don't know, there's just something more like powerful or more valuable when you have it written down on a piece of paper rather than in your notes. Like your notes is almost just a little reminder to get something from the shops or to, you know, remind you that you got a dentist appointment or something. But when you write it down, it automatically means more. It's like a goal or a dream, or like, you know, I guess you're almost manifesting it already by writing it down. Yeah. I mean, I'm not a big manifestation sort of promoter, but I do sort of believe that when you have it somewhere in the back of your mind, you are subconsciously striving towards that particular goal without ever actually knowing it. And then at the end, you reach it and you go, oh, wait, I wrote about that like however many years ago. But yeah, no, I'm getting completely off topic there. Could you just sort of introduce yourself, Kerry, to people that may not be familiar with what you do?
Yeah, so my name is Kerrie Droban, and I am a true crime writer. I've written 7 books. 6 of them are published. My 7th one is going to be published next summer, so July 20th, 2022. And they're all different. They kind of some cross genre. Some I call them my I write the 1% of true crime that a lot of true crime writers would never touch. So my genre, my niche, I guess, was writing about outlaw motorcycle gangs. And that sort of bled into undercover investigations, and it bled into writing about mafia, and that symbiotic relationship between outlaw biker gangs and the mafia. And then I also write straight crime, which is more of what people are more familiar with, which is I wrote about a case in Tucson. It was a big bombing, and that was sort of like a whodunit, and it was an investigation into that case and who committed those crimes. And the one that's coming out in July is about the mass shooter, James Holmes, who was the Colorado movie theater killer. So they kind of it's the whole gamut, I guess. It's the whole gamut. So I spent most of my career writing about gangs. I'm also an attorney. So I've been an attorney for a very long time, and I began as a prosecutor. So I began prosecuting gangs and moved into criminal defense, and then eventually moved into capital litigation, which got me into a really keen interest in the pathology of the criminal mind, because I was really fascinated by why people do the things they do. You know, why I mean, my very first case, I represented somebody that called the Block Monster. And so I was really fascinated by how this person, you know, where this person came from, how could somebody commit such an evil act? And so that really got me fascinated in that. And it really, the two careers sort of marry each other. You know, it's what I do as a lawyer. I investigate the pathology, I investigate the criminal conduct and the crime itself, and then I do that as well as a writer. So it's been a perfect blend of both.
Yeah, it's a perfect blend, but it's also like a huge spectrum of not just in terms of your books, but in terms of what you've done. It's like a huge spectrum from, you know, gangs all the way to looking at sort of individuals and even the mass shooter. The Colorado one, was that one that was recent?
That happened in 2012. Yes, it
All
was
right,
the Dark Knight murders. It was the premiere of The Dark Knight Rises, and he was a Colorado. He was a student, a PhD student at and so he went and committed a mass shooting, and he is now in prison serving the longest sentence of any criminal. in the United States. So it was a pretty fascinating case. It was written from the point of view of the psychiatrist who treated him.
Wow. Well, we'll definitely get into that. And what did you refer to him as, the block monster? Or was it?
My very first case was the block monster.
Right,
Yeah.
we'll get into that too as well. I want to first start off though, however, at the beginning of when you're talking about when you got into becoming a defense attorney, you were a prosecutor first. What was that like, and how did your sort of interest in looking at gangs and looking at the pathology of criminals? How did that come about through being a defense attorney?
Actually, it was very much by accident, which is interesting. Although I don't really believe in accidents. I think that everything happens for a reason. There aren't any coincidences. But when I became a prosecutor, I was a prosecutor for about 4 years, and as a prosecutor, I really got a ton of experience in trial work, and so I was sort of thrown everything that baby prosecutors are thrown, and got a massive amount of trial experience, and really loved the ability to tell a story. And so, I'd always been a writer, but I've never really been a true crime writer. I'd been a fiction writer before that. And so the idea of getting up in front of a jury and presenting one side of the story was very fascinating to me, because when I would see the defense attorney do it, I realized there's another side. And so, a prosecutor is building a case, and a defense attorney is deconstructing that case. So you have the same set of facts, and it's just how you present them. So after I got all of my trial experience, I worked in doing a lot of gang cases and helping, before I was even an attorney, helping to write a manual about gang prosecution, which is really ironic too. But so when I became a defense attorney, my very first case out of the gate was working as co-counsel on a capital case. And the capital case was State versus Ring, which went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and it overturned 180 cases nationwide. So that's how we got jury sentencing in the United States. So juries can now sentence somebody to life or death. They're the judges, essentially. So it changed the whole landscape of how people defend criminals in capital cases. So when I got into the capital arena at the time, I was really just right out of the gate. I didn't have a lot of experience at all, but I was starting to get really fascinated by the investigation behind it, because in order to sentence somebody, when you start a capital case, it's all mitigation. It's all, let's figure out how we're going to save this person's life. And so by doing that, you go into the behind the scenes of a person's life. And so, you're looking at their childhood, you're looking at their substance abuse, their relationships with people. I've had some fascinating cases as a defense attorney, and some that have just sort of, startled me. I realized that I had such an inside window to these incredibly violent, evil people, but a lot of them had these horrific abusive pasts. And so, by presenting that to a jury, it's painting them in 3-dimensional. So they're not just monstrous, or their acts are monstrous, but they're not necessarily monsters as people. And so that was something that I found very compelling, and it sort of informed my whole career that way. And it's given me a lot of ability to get inside people's heads. And so when I write the books that I write, I'm actually in the heads of these people. So I was able to get into the heads of, I wrote a book called The Last Chicago Boss, which was about the godfather of the Chicago outlaw motorcycle gang. And so I got into his head in order to write his story. So it was in a lot of ways sort of a hybrid, a crossover from true crime into almost memoir. And so I realized that was the gift, basically, being able to understand a case from the inside out. So it was really good background into my writing career.
Yeah, no, again, there's so much to digest there. As so just to be clear, did you go from being a prosecutor to a defense attorney? Is that how it works? Like you have to be a prosecutor first, and then you can go defense.
Well, not necessarily, but that was my path. I mean, I had set out to be a career prosecutor. I mean, when I became a prosecutor, I believed in justice. I believed in, taking these people down, and my whole perspective changed as I was doing prosecution. I mean, I realized that as a prosecutor, I didn't have a lot of discretion. I was sort of following the party line, and it really didn't suit me, as it didn't suit my personality, because I was always seeing the three-dimensional person, and I was always questioning that and saying, well, wait a second, what if it actually didn't happen that way, or what if there's another reason behind it? And so for me, it was a natural segue to go into defense work, because as a defense lawyer, it's very creative. I mean, as you can imagine, you're coming up with all kinds of defenses and ways people can maybe deconstruct a case. But at the same time, I never really believed I was getting people off. I believed I was presenting a different perspective, and I believed I was defending the Constitution. And so, everybody's entitled to a fair trial. And so from my viewpoint, it was, how can I give this person the fairest shake possible in the justice system? And so it became a matter of truth and justice for me. And so defense work really kind of personified that for me, because it was creative. I was dealing with the client itself, himself. I was actually interacting with them and getting to know them as people. Whereas a prosecutor, you're not. It's very just the facts, ma'am, So it was a wonderful way for me to know both perspectives, because when I write my straight true crime, I can see the detective work. So I can know what that's like to investigate a case. When I do the books that I write that deal with undercover investigations, I can also know from that perspective, because that's what a prosecutor does. They're looking at it as an investigation. What did the cops do? What were the procedural stuff that happened before that? Whereas on the defense side, I'm looking at the criminal itself. So it's really great to have that background and that perspective. Not every defense attorney was a former prosecutor, and not every prosecutor goes into defense, but that was my path. And so when I was newly into defense work is when I got approached to write my first true crime, which was Running with the Devil. And it was really just sort of, I was positioned in the right way to do this. And so every book that I've written, essentially, I've been approached and asked to write it. So it's not as if I'm going out and looking for the story. I'm being asked to do it based on my skill set, based on where I'm at in terms of that. I mean, I was approached by the operatives in that investigation to write their story. And I think they asked me to write their story. This is Running with the Devil. They asked me to write their story because I was a lawyer and I understood confidentiality and the kind of the veil of secrecy that surrounded the writing of this book. So I held on to those secrets, and so it was a really interesting project for me. I don't know if you want me to go into that or not.
Yeah, no. I've just got a quick question. What do you mean by operatives? Who are operatives?
Oh.
Sorry, I'm not like massive. I'm not got a lot of knowledge in law and courts and the justice.
No, that's fine. The operatives they're undercover special agents working for the ATF. So they're government operatives that went in and did an investigation into the Hells Angels. And so it was the
who, sorry?
The Hells Angels.
Oh, okay. So that's a gang, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Gang.
Okay. So they were doing So they were doing undercover work for the government or on behalf of the government into this Hells Angels, which is a gang. Right. Yes. Okay, that makes sense. But why specifically do they want you to write? What does writing a book? How does that benefit them?
Well, the interesting thing is this was a landmark criminal investigation. It had never been done before. Nobody had ever infiltrated the Hells Angels. I mean, not a government agency. And so they really wanted their story told because it was complete improvisation, what they did. There wasn't a manual or a script or anything. They came together, and it was their sort of brilliance and how they came as an ensemble cast, I like to say, and infiltrated. And they didn't actually manage to take down the Hells Angels. That was their goal, but they infiltrated this gang, and they got a lot of intelligence, and they wanted to share that story on how they did it. And it was just sort of their last hurrah. Basically, they thought it would make a great movie, actually. And it is a great story. And I think at the time they couldn't, it's a crime actually to sell your story while you're still an undercover operative for a government agency. So when they approached me to do it, I couldn't tell anybody that I was doing it. I mean, there wasn't anything in writing. There wasn't, I mean, every interview, every document that I received was all done sort of in secrecy. And so they were doing an undercover investigation, and I was sort of writing it undercover. So for 2 years, we were having this sort of, this exchange. I mean, I call it like the deep throat. I would go and meet them in hotel rooms, and
Oh, wow.
yeah, places that were just like, I mean, all of a sudden I was cast into this quasi-journalist role of going and interviewing people that I never in 100 million years would have thought that would not only tell me their story, but that I would get to interview. And so that sort of launched my career into true crime, because from that book came a lot of other books. I basically wrote about all of the big 5 outlaw motorcycle gangs. They all came to me, and I wrote them, and they're all of them are different stories. So it's not, one is taking a government investigation. One is actually a rival gang of the Hells Angels, and it's taken from the point of view of somebody who grew up in an organized crime family. And then another one is a contract informant that goes undercover. That one was made into a television show. So that was Vagos, Mongols, and Outlaws, and it was made into Gangland Undercover. So they just sort of all, and then the last one was The Last Chicago Boss, which was the godfather of the Outlaws. So they all sort of were different stories from different rival gangs, but they all kind of intertwined with each other. So it was an interesting journey for me. So I feel like I am an expert of sorts, about outlaw motorcycle gangs.
No, 100%. Like it's so fascinating with with the sort of groups and gangs that you're working with, and the fact that you're undercover whilst writing about an undercover investigation, that even makes it even more sort of high intensity and exciting. I definitely want to check these books out, because it seems fascinating as well. Just the whole sort of story behind it, and I've always I feel like I'm quite similar in the sense that I like understanding why people do certain things. Like I think it's very easy, and I think the vast majority of the public sort of look at a criminal and go, yeah, send him to jail, send him to in America, send him to their death row and whatever. And it's not that I'm not against that completely. I think certain people are horrible human beings, and I don't think there's an excuse. And I don't think you're trying to find an excuse for individuals doing particular crimes. But I think it's always important, especially as humans, and especially as almost the ones who the ones who are logical, compared to, I guess, these murderers or whatever they are, who are very illogical and irrational because of what they've done. It is our job to understand why people are doing that in order to prevent people from doing it again. Like ultimately, that is the goal, isn't it?
Exactly. Yes. And yes, information is prevention. Education is prevention. Yes.
Exactly. Have you, in terms of sort of all these different groups that you've seen, is there a sort of or groups that you've written about? Is there a sort of a commonality between all of them? Something that seems to be present in all of these gangs or groups or individuals?
That's an interesting question. I would say, as far as the gangs, the commonality is a desire to belong. What I found really fascinating about writing about these motorcycle gangs is that they're really not so different from a lot of the constructs and organizations that, non-criminals have. I mean, so for instance, so you have the outlaw motorcycle gangs, you have a lot of police biker gangs, or not gangs, I should say police biker clubs, that in a lot of ways emulate the biker gangs. They have similar websites, they have similar runs, which are bike runs. They give to charitable organizations. I mean, there's a lot of commonality between them, which makes that disturbing and interesting at the same time. In one of my books, the outlaw motorcycle gangs, they want to be known as rebels and nonconformists, and yet they're probably the most conforming group that I've run into. They have rules and bylaws and a constitution and a code of conduct, and a way that there are only certain people that can join and prospect, and so they have a uniform, and they have all these things that make it very conformist. And in that respect, they really emulate and resemble a lot of other organizations that we have. For example, scouting, for example, police work. These are all groups that attract certain people, and they have certain rules and codes of conduct and activities that they all do, and uniforms, and that's what I found really striking about all of this. Like, there's only 6 degrees of separation between a lot of them. Now, granted, the gangs are a criminal syndicate, and so they're a criminal fraternity, if you will, and their goal is very different than a lot of these other organizations that I've just described. But as far as why they get together, why they attract certain people, that is all very similar, and it's almost like they have a similar playbook, and that's what I find really fascinating, this need and desire to belong to an organization. I mean, that's why colleges have fraternities, or sororities, but since most of the criminals groups are male, I'll just use them as fraternities. Fraternities and scouting and bike clubs, and it's anything that is a club or an organization or something that somebody else wants to belong to so that they feel okay about themselves, I find fascinating. And then there's this hierarchy in a lot of the clubs, which is interesting too, and maybe that's changing a little bit now, but a lot of the hierarchy in the clubs that I've described don't readily accept women. So there's this bar or this ban on a whole population, which doesn't make any sense. Or it's the way that they view women that's very similar, as sort of in the gangs, for example, women are property of, and the women have their own hierarchy. And they also compile from a similar group. So these women that join these gangs are joining it for a similar reason, an idea that they want to belong. A lot of them come from runaways or, derelict backgrounds, and now they're suddenly important and they belong to somebody else. And so that's that commonality. And yet there are women that break that mold and break that rule, which I also found fascinating. There are women that, they come from what we would call regular walks of life. They're bankers, they're lawyers, they're CEOs, they're people that come into that biker world and they want to adopt a different persona for just a little while. And they want to be this wild, almost alter ego. And I found that fascinating. And that, the women that I interviewed that were either part of the gang or just wanted to participate on the weekend, that wanted to hang out with the biker gangs. I mean, it just blew my mind that there was that faction of women that just needed that sort of alter persona for a while, just to almost get out of their skin.
So there were women in the gang who just join on the weekend and then just go back to their day jobs on the weekdays.
Yes. So there were two groups. There were women that wanted to be part of the hierarchy of that gang. I mean, they were never allowed to prospect. They were never allowed to be made members of the biker gang, but they had their hierarchy, so they could become property of, it could become old ladies of. So that was that faction. But yeah, at parties or runs of these biker gangs, there were women that came in from what I would call, regular society, and would just want to be associated with the bikers for that weekend. And they were completely, I mean, they had completely separate lives during the week. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, the reason why I wanted to ask you that is because I remember years ago, I've sort of always, well, for a long time been interested in crime or just anything to do with history or politics, as particularly sort of the bad side of history and the bad side of politics. So like Nazi Germany, for example, for history, or in terms of politics, sort of conspiracy theories or groups like KKK. And I remember years ago watching a documentary, and they were inside, a KKK group, I guess, or a fraternity, to use your word. And there were women there, and they were sort of the typical housewife. They were cooking, cleaning, or whatever. And the interviewer asked them the question. They're like, "Why do you want to be here?" They're like, "Well, this is where we belong. This is where we feel accepted. When we're out there, we get treated like whatever, so and so. But when we're here, at least we've got something. At least we've got roles and we've got sort of jobs that matter almost. Like for them, it felt like during the weekday, their 9 to 5, they were irrelevant. They didn't matter. And even though in this gang, they're also in some ways irrelevant because they're not allowed to be official members, they're still sort of given more of a status than society gives them. They're still given more importance because they're still aware of the fact that, oh well, I get to stitch the uniforms of the big guys that get to wear it. Do you know what I mean? It's like, for example, if you're the president's PA, you're going to tell everyone that you're the president's PA, aren't you? Because you're like, I'm the PA to the president. Even if you just make his tea, you're still going to tell everyone because it's the president. It's almost giving you some sort of status, but also you have no status because all you're doing is making tea for the president. Do you know what I mean? And I've always found that sort of fascinating because it explains why people join it rather than sort of people assuming that, oh well, all the people that join gangs or all the people that commit horrific acts are just crazy and they're biologically crazy and they were just made different. When really, no, there's a story. Just like you said, there's always a story behind all these people. And I know you don't focus on this subject, but when it comes to sort of terrorist groups, right? I just want to ask you, in terms of like groups like ISIS. So there's a girl who a lot of people in the UK will be familiar of. Her name's Shamima Begum. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. And she went over to ISIS. She became an ISIS bride, as they're known as. She had kids. I think some of them passed away. Maybe one of them's alive. I'm not too sure. And then now she wants to come back. And there's this huge ongoing debate on, well, should the UK allow her to come back? Because she still doesn't regret what she's done. She said she'd still do it over if she go back. She could go back. And my perspective has always been, well, I can guarantee you she was groomed in a certain way. And we're not using the term groomed, but she was groomed because she was vulnerable. She didn't have anything else. She didn't have a role. She didn't feel like she belonged. And that's what they target, if you know what I mean. I don't know what's your sort of perspective on that, based on the very sort of little context I've given you about Shamima Begum. What would you sort of say about that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that they are the vulnerables. I mean, they're the ones that are targeted. A lot of times they're idealists. They're looking for a way to matter. I mean, and again, like you said, it's not an excuse for the behavior, but it's a rational explanation for irrational behavior.
That's perfect. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly, yeah.
Yeah, and I've seen that, and I really I think I do understand that allure. It's it's the need to be relevant. It's the need to feel like you belong to an organization. I mean, however misguided that was, but it's the same need, you know, to want to belong to an organization that thinks that you're valuable. And so, and it's the same pull of a cult, for example, or, you know, and maybe even some of these criminal syndicates that I write about. It's the same thing, where people, I mean, exactly what you said, they have a role, they have a structure, there's a purpose to them getting up in the morning. And that's really, these are basic human needs that are not fulfilled on a regular societal level. I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. People don't want to blend, they don't want to be wallflowers. They want to have purpose and they want to matter. And unfortunately, it's those vulnerables that are most at risk, right? They're preyed on. And that's what they look for. They look for people that are, you know, they're either struggling financially or they're struggling, you know, with their own moral compass, if you will, to figure out where they belong. And so those are the people that are going to be pulled in, and they're very misguided, but for however brief moment, they feel like they matter and they're part of that group. And that's exactly what happens in a lot of these gangs. That's how they get recruited. Yeah.
I know we've sort of come to the conclusion that, or at least I'm going to assume that we've come to the conclusion that these criminals are made. They're not born like this. They're made over long periods of time. But is there situations where biologically someone is more likely to commit a crime or a horrific crime? Or is that just not the case? Is it always sociological?
No, you know, that's a really good question. It's something that I'm fascinated in. I do believe that there are some that are born. And those are the psychopaths. I think that, and I think psychopaths can also be, you know, the whole nature nurture thing. But I think that, and the reason I say this is psychopaths, true psychopaths, you know, like, I think her name was Rhoda Penmark, right? They wrote a movie about her, The Bad Seed. She's born this way. She's a psychopath from very early in her childhood. So like, I think the earliest psychopath that was ever really interviewed and recorded was 5. So you think about, I mean, this is a girl who was hurting her brother, who was 3. She was throwing him against the wall, breaking his arm, doing all of the things that you hear about, right? That trilogy of, you know, the making of a Jeffrey Dahmer, for example, somebody that this is what, there's something wrong with them at birth. They don't have empathy. They don't understand I mean, they're lacking that ability to even have a human connection. So humans are more artifacts to them. They're more like, so I do think it's very, very rare, but I do believe that there are some psychopaths that are born, and they can't be cured. So psychopathy, I mean, like true psychopath cannot be cured. And so because they cannot be cured, I do believe they're born that way, but they're rare. And so, you know, that's sort of that interesting hypothesis of like, I call it that watershed moment in a person's life that turns them, right? I mean, so if you take the hypothesis that people are not born evil, there's not a natural born killer, then you have to look for that watershed moment. What is it that turned them? I had a really interesting case one time as a lawyer where my client was a murderer, and he was, you know, being sentenced to life. And at his sentencing, his twin brother appeared at the sentencing, and his twin brother was a lawyer in another state. Yeah, and he gave this really powerful, profound statement to the judge. And after that sentencing, the judge called me and said, I want to tell you something really fascinating about this case, because the judge was fascinated by this too. Like, how do you have 2 brothers? One's a murderer, one's a lawyer.
What? And they were both like together. They weren't split or anything like that.
Well, here's the interesting thing. So what I didn't know about this was when they were 10, the mother died. So this was very early on in my career. So I hadn't gone into the whole mitigation part of this or whatever, but very early on, the mother died and the boys were split. So one brother, the lawyer, went to live with the aunt, who was very nurturing and, you know, put him on the right path, financially stable. The other twin went into foster care. So that to me started this whole thing of like, wow, that was the watershed moment. Now, you know, whether that actually was the thing that caused it, I don't know, but it's certainly very compelling. Because you look at that and say, wow, you know, what would have happened had the twins been taken together?
Yeah.
So that is an education moment of like, you know, don't separate children at birth or give them that nurturing thing. But on the other hand, you know, you have a client that doesn't have that background, that is literally, you know, I mean, I've had this too in capital cases where you go through their history and there's absolutely nothing in there that is going to point to that watershed moment, you know, and then you kind of conclude, wow, maybe they were just born that way. And they call it antisocial personality disorder, which is like the kiss of death when you're a capital lawyer. You don't want to hear that. So if your expert comes back and says they have this, you're done, you know, because there's nothing. I mean, that to me is psychopathy.
At that point, so just to carry on from that, at that point, let's say the expert has come out and said this, or you're quite confident that this is a case of I can't find anything. I think this is where people sort of kind of have a negative attitude towards attorneys or lawyers and whatever, because the belief is that they're only in it for the payday. They defend whoever can give them the most money, and they don't care who the person is. They'll just try and get them off, and they'll just try and find something. And we're seeing this more and more, an increase of, oh well, he's got mental health issues, so you should let him off. I think that's the public perception, at least, right? And I don't know what your reaction to that is, but at that point when you're quite confident, or you yourself believe that, oh, this person doesn't have a watershed moment, what's your thinking then?
Well, so at that moment, then I'm looking to make sure that this person gets a fair trial. So I'm not looking to convince a jury that there's some redeeming quality in this person, because there isn't. And so, but I still have to make sure that he has a fair trial. So, you know, you still have to make sure that whatever evidence, like for example, I once represented a serial killer who, there was a part of the case, I mean, funny and crazy as it sounds, he drove a white van, and in the van, he had a Chucky doll. The Chucky doll was stuck to the back of the window of the van. So, you know, I'm not going to go out there and tell the jury that this guy is a choir boy, right? But I am going to fight to get that Chucky doll out of evidence so the jury doesn't hear about it. Because if the jury hears about the Chucky doll, I'm done and he's done. And that's not a fair trial, because now they're convicting him based on an image that, you know, of course he's a serial killer, right? So that's my focus will shift as a defense attorney to, okay, what evidence is really damning, that is prejudicial, that is just not going to give this guy a fair shake. You know, he's got to be tried on the crimes that he committed, not on, you know, once drives a van, has a Chucky doll, must be serial killer. You know, so not on stereotype. So he has to be tried on the crime itself. So it's very, very challenging to do that, and it doesn't feel good, you know. And there's always this piece of me in the background going, okay, well, there's not anything redeeming. You know, there was my very first case where I represented the Black Monster. I had to go and do an oral argument, you know, before the Supreme Court. And the one question, I'll never forget.
Sorry, what was that? What argument? Sorry.
Oh, an oral argument. So when you have a capital case, you have to present your case to the Supreme Court. So you're going before the justices, and you're standing up at a podium, and you have 20 minutes to do your case, right? So it's a really interesting experience.
So these are
It's
like
also,
the top dogs of like
yes,
the court
top
system.
dog.
Yeah. So these are like the top. But just for people who don't know like what Supreme Court and justices are, it's like basically the top, the creme de la creme of like if the government had done anything corrupt, it would go straight to these top guys essentially.
Yes, it's very intimidating. They sit very high up. They're like a row of black robes. And then you walk into the Supreme Court, and you have this little podium, and there's buzzers on the podium. So you have a red light and a green light, and you have 20 minutes to make your case for why, why you're there, like what the issues are in the case. And this was my first case, and I had these justices ask me this one zinger of a question, which really was the question. The only question that mattered was, why should we save his life? Because this is like the last gatepost to death, basically. So if you don't win this oral argument, he's getting he's going to be executed. So it's very, very stressful. But I remember standing up there and thinking, when they asked me that question, why should we save his life? And I thought, it made me pause and think, I don't know, like I had to really think about it. So that's when I realized there are these like markers, in a person's life that literally lean back to it. And so I was able to come up with them, for the justices, but it didn't save his life. But I'm always looking for redemption in a person. And so my theme when I write books is, what is the redemption? Like, what's the redeeming quality? Why should we care about the person that I'm writing about? And so it really kind of informed the whole landscape of how I write, so I never want to write anything sensational. I'm never writing it to make a buck, because we don't make a lot of money as a true crime writer, but you want it to have meaning. Like, what's the redeeming quality?
Oh, so that was the block monster, was it?
Yes.
So now because I was going to get into that. So could you tell us a bit more about who? Am I saying it right? Is it BLOCK? Block.
Yes.
Right. So who was the block monster? Why did you get that name? Tell me a bit more about this, because you said that name.
Yeah, it was a fascinating case. It was a very, very sad case, and I'll never forget it. And not only was it my first case, but it was also the facts of it were just gut-wrenching. So this block monster was a young gang member, really kind of a street gang member, and he was young. He was 19. And he murdered a witness to a robbery case. And the witness was a woman, a mother, who had 3 children. And so he murdered the mother while she was reading her 3-year-old a bedtime story. And the bedtime story was Sendak's book, Where the Wild Things Are. And I'll never forget that. So she had a license plate that said, my 3 sons, so she absolutely adored her children. She was just a witness in the wrong place at the wrong time. And she was murdered because she was going to testify. And so he got the death penalty because he murdered a witness who was going to testify. So it wasn't even the underlying crime, which was a robbery. It was the fact that he murdered this witness. And he did it in cold blood. He did it in such a horrific way. So he was known as the Block Monster, and his crime was so horrific. So can you imagine, as a baby defense attorney, right out of the gate, having to tell these justices?
Yeah, I was gonna say that is harsh. That so your first case is in front of the justices.
Yeah, it was horrific, because I mean, it took me off guard, because I thought, I don't know, because, as a mother myself, I was like, oh my God, I have to find a redeeming quality in this person. So here's what I found. So this was a very interesting detail. This 19-year-old would come home, and he still wet his bed, okay? And he wet his bed at the age of 12 still. He used to come home and he used to crawl into his mother's bed. His mother was never home, so this was an empty bed. He would crawl into his mother's bed and suck his thumb. So there was obviously horrific trauma in this kid's life. And that's what led him to be so desperate to not want to go to prison for this robbery. So he was robbing this shop, I forget what shop it was, for money. Don't know what the money was used for, but you know, he lived in poverty and his mother was never home. So how ironic is that? He murders a mother who's reading a bedtime story to his son, and yet he would go home and get into his mother's bed and suck his thumb and still wet his bed at the age of 12. So it was a really interesting parallel, and it kind of gave me pause, and I thought, wow, you know, there's something here. There's some traumatic incident in this kid's life that led him to this place. And that's what really started my whole, you know, journey into what is mitigation, what are these redeeming qualities, were there mental health issues, you know, were all these other factors that came into play. And that was the story behind the story. Now, it didn't save his life, but it made me think, wow, is there anything here? Is there anything redeeming that would warrant him to be saved?
See, like I know you sort of obviously said that background story, but then if you now were to repeat what he did and killing, you know, a mother while she was reading at her bedtime, so I'm guessing the three kids were there as well, and
Yes.
he just killed her. So did he just kill her and run off?
Yes.
And he knew he killed her, as in it was a...
Yes.
Right. Okay.
And the kids were there, so he traumatized the kids.
Yeah.
You know.
So I feel like, again, and this isn't anything against you or lawyers in general, but I feel like this is a public perception thing where the public, you know, including myself, will look at that and go, it doesn't matter that he wet his bed and he had a, you know, he sucked his thumb. He killed a mother in front of, not only did he kill the mother, but he killed him in front of 3 other kids.
Yeah.
That in itself is just like, if I was a Supreme Justice, I'd be like, what is this woman telling me? Kill him. I don't know. I don't care what she says to me.
Well,
right?
and you would be right, because he was executed. I mean, he was given the death penalty. I mean, he was condemned. And that's the thing that, I mean, that's what makes this job so difficult. But it also makes me really reflect on, you know, what is redemption and who actually deserves to be saved, you know, like when, because you're right. I mean, that was a horrific crime. And he earned that title, the Black Monster, you know, but it makes the job of a defense attorney so difficult. Not that anybody deserves, I mean, not that we deserve any sympathy, but it's just, it shows you the whole perspective of it is so challenging and difficult. And you know, honestly, 9 times out of 10, it doesn't exonerate and it doesn't excuse the crime. It gives background. And really all we're talking about is, does the person deserve life in prison, or do they deserve death? And, you know, it's not like the guy's getting off, but it's, do we want to spend all of this time and energy and effort to execute somebody or to keep them in life in prison? I mean, it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. So I want to ask you the question then. So say, for example, based on what you knew, and let's say you for that day, you were going to duplicate yourself and you were going to become one of the justices as well, right? So you were about to see your other duplicate present exactly the case that you did. Would you have, based on everything that you knew as well, would you have sentenced him to death?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean,
So,
yeah.
So at that point, as a defense attorney, are you like, well, I've got a job to do. I've just got to make sure he gets a free trial, like you said, and ultimately the consequence is probably thingy. Yeah. What's your sort of thinking then?
You know, the interesting thing is, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, because I'm court appointed, you know, the Supreme Court appoints me. to do these indigent cases, and I can't really get off of them unless, unless there's like a huge conflict. I mean, there's only been one death case that I've actually withdrawn off of. And I mean, that's pretty amazing. And the reason I withdrew off of it, I mean, this was a guy he was a psychopath. I mean, there was nothing there. There was no redemption, which is not really the reason I got off of the case, but I couldn't help him. I didn't feel like I was being a good advocate for him. And so that's the first time really in my career that I made an ethical decision to get off of that case, because I thought, I'm not the person for this criminal. I didn't have compassion or empathy. There wasn't anything in his background, and his crime was so disturbing that I just couldn't do it. Like, I couldn't do it from an ethical perspective. And so I got off of it. So I always try, no matter what case I have, to be able to go into the history of them and see, what's here. And in most cases, there's something there. I know I'm not going to win it. I mean, defense lawyers really, we lose almost everything that we do, especially on which is probably as it should be. So I don't really ever consider it a win. Even if I get somebody life in prison, it's not really a win for me, because, there's so much wreckage. There's so much debris from what this person did. I call it the ripple effect. There are no winners in any of these crimes. But I feel like if I can give the best presentation, if I can make sure that the law is followed, make sure that there's fairness, then I've done my job. And then I've been a good representative, but if I can't do that, then I need to get off the case. And so I'm always kind of gauging my own moral compass when I do these cases, like how much am I going to push my own envelope, as long as I can sleep at night.
Yeah, I feel like that's the sort of important. Well, that's what I'm thinking about now, is like, you're constantly, how often does the average person have to really balance their moral compass, like have to constantly think about questions like that? Not really. We have our morals, we have our beliefs, and we go about our day-to-day business. Maybe we'll do one little bad thing, like we'll steal a pen or something, or we lie. But when it comes to this, you're sort of constantly, you're balancing, your own personal beliefs, and then this person deserves life or deserves, the death sentence, but at the same time, you care about this person a little bit because the history as well. And it seems also complicated. And I found it interesting there when you said, defense attorneys don't ever really win. There's no such thing as winning, because essentially it's, especially for you, it's either the person gets life imprisonment, and then there's all this other, the wreckage is still there. Just because someone gets life imprisonment or they get the death sentence isn't going to bring back the other person that they might have killed or whatever they've done. It's not going to reverse the effects. They're still going to be there. And obviously you almost still have to deal with that. In terms of, and I think this is sort of a common question that people would want to know. And again, it's a perception on lawyers or anyone that's in law. If you were to win a case, I know you said you can't win. Does that mean a bigger benefit for you? Or do you get any sort of benefit? Because you just said you're court appointed. So does that like improve your rank? Does it give you more money, or does it I don't know, what does that do? Does it do anything, or is it just you get the same pay, the same as long you just got to work? How does that work?
Yeah, it doesn't. There's not a monetary reward. I guess if I was. I do have a private practice as well. So I guess there is a little bit of a ripple effect where inmates and people will hear about the win, and they'll want to retain you or hire, but the misperception amongst a lot of criminals is, just because you win one case, whatever that means, like a hung jury is a win, I guess, where you have a mistrial, and that's a win, but the case is going to get tried again. Or in the very, very rare chance that someone gets acquitted. Usually they're getting acquitted because, evidence didn't come in or a witness didn't show up. I'm a realist. I don't think that people actually get acquitted because they're innocent. I think they get acquitted for a lot of other reasons. And the problem is that when somebody hires you based on a win, their expectations are way too high, because every case is different, every fact pattern is different, and the likelihood of repeating that is very slim. I mean, there are some that do that, and I don't know, maybe they're great pickers, they pick the right client, but in my experience, I mean, I have had some wins. I would consider my first capital case that overturned all the death penalty cases. I mean, those are wins, and I did get a lot of other cases as a result of that, but they didn't increase my bottom line by any means. I mean, I don't think you get rich being a criminal defense attorney, court-appointed criminal defense attorney. We don't get rich. In fact, we get a lot of hate mail. We get a lot of people that ask us, how do you sleep at night? I mean, those are things that kind of come with the territory, of being a defense lawyer.
I know obviously we haven't got a lot of time because you do need to go. I want to ask you I want to ask you more about the Colorado shooter as well, but we've not got time for it. So I want to ask you just sort of a few quick questions, I guess. In terms of like, has there ever been a big sort of the biggest win, I guess? I know I'm still focusing on win or whatever, but for you was, for example, being able to present 20 minutes in front of justices. There's a lot of defense attorneys that probably never had the chance to do that. So for your first case to go there, that's pretty mental. What would you say is like the biggest win for you, or what constitutes as a win almost?
I think a win for me is if I truly believe justice has been served. If somebody, and it's never, I mean, I think I'm enough of a realist to know when I go into a case, there really aren't a lot of innocence. But I think a win for me is if I can truly help somebody either get a better deal, or they know they've committed the crime, but I'm helping them through some aspect of it. I think I have had maybe one or two cases in the history of my cases, and I've been doing this 28 years, so it was a long time now. But I've had probably a couple where the person really didn't do it, and they were able to get out of prison. So the most interesting case I had was a man who served 8 years in prison for a crime that did not exist and that he didn't commit. It was the most extraordinary case that I've ever been involved in, honestly. I did the whole background investigation of it. It turned out to be a ruse that was created by the lead detective in the case, who happened to be having an affair with one of the informants and wanted to cover it up. So he created a crime, and my client got convicted of it because the detective lied on the stand. And I had it in post-conviction relief. So post-conviction is after my guy's convicted, he's already served 8 years in prison, and now I'm going back and doing the investigation and presenting the case. So when I presented that case, the prosecution had to dismiss it because they realized a huge miscarriage of justice had just happened. But the thing is, the guy got out of prison, he was released, but he'll never get the 8 years back. That's the tragedy of it. The great part is that I was able to figure this out, able to investigate what happened and get him some justice. So that was probably the best case that I've ever worked on.
How did you find that out then? Like 8 years after it all happened, how are you unraveling that whole, how are you going all the way 8 years back and go investigating that when people have probably forgotten bits and bobs?
How did I go about it?
Yeah. How you go about that, as in finding all that out about the affair and all that?
Going back through transcripts and interviews, and and then having that agent. I mean, he got in trouble with his own organization, but having that agent didn't want his career to unravel, and he didn't want his marriage to unravel. And so, but meanwhile, an innocent man went to prison for 8 years. So it was a really extraordinary case because, at the end of the day, my client got his freedom, but I mean, he's had to almost rehabilitate his life, I mean, he had to figure out, what do you do now? Like, what's
8
next?
years, that's a long time.
It's a long
Yeah, I had a
time. Yeah,
I,
it's really
I
interesting perspective, though.
it is. I mean, I did a recent episode with a guy called Ramon Reed, and he'd been in prison for 24 to 27 years, I think. He'd just come out. Yeah, and it was fascinating to speak with him. I would definitely recommend for you to check out, anyone else who's listening, because obviously 27, that's longer than, I'm 19, so I'm the same age as the Block Monster guy, by the way.
Yeah.
So 24 years, that's my entire life and more. And the way he just spoke about sort of his experience there and life afterwards, and he recorded it. So he's now on YouTube now as well. He created a YouTube channel. And someone record, because the first thing he wanted to do when he came out was he wanted to go to Walmart. He'd never been to a Walmart before, and he wanted to go to Walmart and he wanted to look at all the cereals. And the video is so wholesome. It's basically him just going, there's 1, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4, there's 5 different, 6 different, 7 different cereals. He's fascinated by it all. And that was obviously over 24 to 27 years. 8 years is still a ridiculously long time. And for him to get 8 years for something he didn't do, he never committed. And the worst part about that, it isn't that everyone else thinks he's done it. It's the fact that he knows himself that he didn't do it. And yet he's in there. That is what kills you on the inside. Like, you can pretend to be innocent, but when you've not done something and you're facing the consequences of that action, I can't imagine that. That's like the scariest thing that could happen, is you getting convicted for something that you haven't done. I mean, I know you obviously have to go, Kerry, so I'm going to leave you on. I'm going to end it on this last question. Hopefully, we can do a part 2, because I think you've got some amazing stories that I really want to sort of delve deeper into. I want to talk more about the Colorado shooter and just more of sort of some of the cases that you've worked on. So if you're interested in, and your followers are interested in as well, then I'd love to do a part 2 with you, because I think some of your stories are incredible. And I think I've had to force you to rush through them, because I just wanted to get into as much things as possible. So hopefully we can do a part 2 as well if you're interested.
Thank you.
My final question to you is, what sort of advice would you give to people that are around 20 years old, just right now, who don't really know what they're doing? And, would you tell them to get into being a defense attorney?
I think I would advise people to follow their passion. And sometimes you don't know what that is, but just listen to that inner voice that tells you, you're on the right path, you're doing the right thing. You're helping somebody. For me personally, it's all about service. It's all about, what can I do to educate, communicate, inform somebody about maybe a subculture, maybe something that people don't know a lot about. Because I think the more that you expose and the more that you understand something that, is maybe out of people's reach, the more compassion a person has, or the more understanding, the less hate. So I think that would be the advice, just follow the passion.
That is it for this week's episode of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm definitely going to do a part 2. It was amazing. We didn't even get into so many different topics that I was just thinking of on the spot and that she was talking about, and I really, really want to get into some of the cases that she worked on, and anything else that anyone else might be interested in. If you did enjoy it, then please do consider hitting that like button. Let me know in the comments below if you'd be interested in a part 2 on the sort of different topics that you'd want us to talk about. Even if you're not interested, I'm going to do a part 2 because it was so interesting. It was interesting for me, and I can't wait to do it. Other than that, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future podcast episodes, including another one with Kerry, hopefully. Leave a like, share us on your Instagram, tagging at MMHY Podcast. Tell your friends. Maybe your friends do law, and maybe they'd be interested in hearing about what Kerry, some of the cases that Kerry's worked on and what it's like. And if they're not doing law, then who cares? Just send it to them anyway. Anyway, I'm rambling on too much. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week. Until next time. I'm sorry for shaking. Yeah, I'll shake that camera.